welcome to the deep dive. You know, sometimes when we think about history, historical origins, we rely on these really neat timelines, don't we?
We do, like 7th century CE, the Bronze Age, Rome's rise and fall, very structured.
Exactly. But what if those established timelines, those maps we all know, were just sort of the surface layer? And underneath, there's this hidden narrative, a story of continuous identity stretching back, well, maybe 14,000 years.
Wow.
And this narrative fundamentally links the birth of a continent and the foundation of a major global religion.
And that's precisely the mission for this deep dive today. We're plunging into a synthesis of history, identity, and religious narrative that's, well, it's pretty radical.
Radical how?
It fundamentally challenges the accepted foundations of the ancient world, you know, and the early Islamic era, too. We're looking at a viewpoint that really demands we rethink what we mean by indigenous and even what we mean by empire.
Okay, that sounds like a huge undertaking. And before we even start to unpack this vast history, we need to be absolutely crystal clear about our source.
Absolutely critical.
This entire deep dive, all the unique claims, these connections we're going to talk about, it's all based entirely on the extensive historical research and analysis put forward by Dr. Khaled Waleed.
That's right, from his YouTube channel, Almighty Covenant.
So just so everyone listening understands, we're guiding you through his very specific framework, his interpretation of these events.
Exactly. Our role here isn't to endorse or refute, but to articulate the complex linkages Dr. Waleed draws, you know, between these really disparate eras.
From prehistory all the way to the 7th century CE.
Right. To show you the coherence of his argument, even where it diverges, sometimes quite sharply, from conventional scholarship.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are traveling far, far back, way beyond the usual starting points for this kind of discussion.
We really are.
We're grounding this entire discussion, as Dr. Waleed does, in the very deep past. We're pushing back 12,000 years before the Common Era.
12,000 BCE. Yeah, when historians usually talk about the Levant, they're focusing, the last 3, maybe 4 millennia?
Right, the Bronze Age, Iron Age, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But Dr. Waleed establishes this historical anchor point way back at 12,000 BCE. And the sheer magnitude of that rewind, it serves a really critical purpose in his argument.
Which is?
It's to establish a sense of history so deep, so profound, that the identity of the original inhabitants becomes, well, almost indisputable. Immutable, you could say.
So why 12,000 BCE specifically? That time frame, that's like late Paleolithic, early Neolithic, right? In that region. Precisely.
It's meant to solidify the idea that the inhabitants we're about to discuss were the original people, the indigenous population rooted in the land before much of what we call civilization even got going.
Okay, so it sets the stage. This is the foundation.
It's the foundational identity block. And according to Dr. Waleed's research, the original inhabitants of what he calls the land of the Arabs were the Canaanites, the Jebusites, and the Palestinians.
Wait, all 3? At that early stage?
Well, they're not presented as like sequential tribes arriving one after another. It's more like different designations for the same core indigenous lineage.
Ah, okay. That's a really crucial synthesis of identity right there. Because conventionally, we tend to treat those names as distinct groups, you know, operating at different times in history.
We do. But Dr. Waleed's framework argues for complete continuity. It states these were the indigenous Arabs rooted in this land. And furthermore, that the Jebusites and the Palestinians of today are the direct, unbroken descendants of these ancestral people.
Wow. That's a claim of continuous lineage over 14,000 years.
It's huge, and it's absolutely the bedrock of the entire argument he builds. It provides this uninterrupted deep history for the indigenous claim to the region. And this foundational identity is absolutely essential for how he then recontextualizes the next major historical player that comes onto the scene.
Yeah.
The Phoenicians.
Right, the Phoenicians. When we typically think of them, it's, you know, sailing ships, vast trade empires, maybe the alphabet.
Purple dye.
Purple dye, exactly. And our background material, you know, maps from standard sources like the World History Encyclopedia, they definitely confirm that huge geographical scope.
Oh, yeah.
Shows their expansion from the coast, Cyprus, all the way across the Med to Spain, basically. Roughly, 11th to 6th centuries BCE?
That's the conventional timeline, yes.
Yeah.
And conventional scholarship tends to view them as a specific kind of maritime-focused civilization that emerged from those coastal cities of Canaan.
But Dr. Waleed's research, It offers something very different.
Very different. A highly radical counterclaim, actually. The source, his research, asserts that Phoenician is not a distinct ethnicity. It's not a separate tribe or people.
So what is it then?
It's simply a descriptive label, a name given to them by outsiders, specifically the Greeks.
Okay, like an exonym.
Exactly. The source explicitly argues that Phoenician is merely a translation of the original Canaanite name or designation. They are simply the maritime, the expansive arm of those ancient Canaanites.
The indigenous Arabs of Palestine, according to this framework.
Correct. So this move completely collapses any distinction between the deep-rooted inhabitants of the land and those powerful masters of the sea. They're one and the same people.
Hold on a second. If the term Phoenician comes from the Greeks, maybe linked to that purple dye trade, like you said, what specific evidence, like linguistic evidence, does the source use to say it's just a translation of how the Canaanites referred to themselves? That feels like a pretty big linguistic jump.
That's a fair question. The source material, as presented, focuses less on dissecting the Greek etymology itself and more on the identity continuity.
Wow, okay.
It argues that the identity these people carried with them across the sea, their cultural core, their historical self-awareness, remained fundamentally Canaanite.
So even if the Greeks called them Phoenicians because of the dye,
they themselves still understood their roots, their lineage, as Canaanite. So in this framework, they were the descendants of the ancient Canaanites, maintaining that core identity, even as outsiders used this trade-related name.
Right, I see the logic within the framework now.
And this single move, redefining the Phoenicians, it fundamentally changes who we think was responsible for that incredible expansion, that massive trade network across the ancient Mediterranean.
It shifts the historical focus entirely. It means the engine of the ancient Mediterranean, that geopolitical powerhouse, was driven by a continuous indigenous Arab identity originating right there in the Levant.
Precisely.
And this brings us to one of the most, provocative claims in the research, I think, that this expansive power didn't just trade with Europe, it actually defined it.
Here's where the narrative really takes a sharp turn. If we accept the premise that the Canaanite Phoenicians controlled the seas,
which this framework does.
Right. Then Dr. Waleed's research applies the concept of colonization, not just setting up trading posts, but actual colonization to Europe itself.
Wow. Okay, so not just economic exchange, but political establishment.
That's the argument. It's presented as a story of political establishment.
So I have to ask, what's the mechanism proposed for this colonization? Beyond just, having trading outposts everywhere, colonization usually implies more direct control, settlement, naming rights.
The mechanism proposed is exactly that: sustained migration and political establishment. The idea is that these Canaanite descendants migrated from the land of Palestine, sailed across the Mediterranean, and actively colonized parts of Europe.
Actively colonized.
Yes. The source material views these early settlements not just as commercial ventures, but as expressions of their central power, establishing outposts, exerting influence, and reshaping the indigenous populations they encountered there.
And the sort of ultimate proof, the crowning assertion of this colonization, is the naming of the continent itself.
That's the linchpin claim, yes. The source asserts that Europe was literally named after these migrating Canaanite peoples.
Okay, how? What's the linguistic connection there?
The connection proposed is very specific, and it's critical to Dr. Waleed's synthesis. The name Europe, he argues, is derived from Arab and Europa.
Arab in Europa.
Which the source interprets as meaning essentially the Arabic, or related to the Arabs. This directly links the continent's very identity back to the indigenous Canaanite Arab identity of the Levant. It makes Europe, in effect, kind of a daughter state or a colonial extension of that ancient Canaanite civilization.
That completely flips the usual script, doesn't it? Usually we think of influence flowing from Greece and Rome outwards.
Totally flips it. It establishes the Levant as the historical epicenter, the origin point from which culture, power, and even naming rights flowed westwards.
Okay, so if this vast network of Canaanite settlements and trade routes dominated the region, what did that mean for the Mediterranean Sea itself geopolitically?
It meant, according to the source, total control. Because of their naval capacity, their trade links between all these states bordering the sea all connected back to that original Canaanite identity. The Mediterranean was basically transformed.
Into what?
Into what the source calls a commercial lake.
A commercial lake, like an internal highway.
Exactly. Their internal highway, controlled and used by what is presented as a single, continuous indigenous people and their network.
A lake that was the lifeline of this huge network.
Mm-hmm.
But empires change, right? Things evolve.
Mm-hmm.
The political landscape shifts dramatically as we get closer to the 7th century CE.
It does.
So how does this Phoenician Canaanite network, this vast system, actively become the political structure of the Byzantine Romans?
Yeah.
It seems like a big jump. What's the proposed mechanism for that handover or transformation?
Yeah, that's a really crucial transitional leap in their argument. The source argues that this expansive Phoenician Canaanite network, having built the commercial and maybe even infrastructural backbone of the region,
Right.
ultimately developed into and became the inherited political and structural extension of the Byzantine Romans.
So not just succeeded by them, but became them.
It suggests that the Byzantine Empire wasn't simply a successor state that took over the geography. It was more like a late-stage cultural and political continuation of this deep-rooted Canaanite geopolitical power structure.
Ah.
The Romans, the Rum, in this specific view, inherited not just territory, but the political infrastructure, and maybe even some echo of that deep-seated identity of the Canaanite world.
Okay, so that makes the Byzantine state fundamentally Levantine in its origins, according to this research, regardless of whatever Hellenic or Latin cultural layers were added on top.
That's the core idea. It's this concept of continuous heritage, this unbroken line.
And it's this notion that leads us directly into the 7th century and the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad's mission, which then transforms this inherited Byzantine structure.
Exactly. According to Dr. Waleed's research, the transition from that Byzantine state to Islam wasn't primarily, say, a clash of external invading armies.
No.
It was mainly presented as an internal ideological transformation. The source defines the pre-existing Byzantine political entity, the Rum, as practicing what it calls monotheistic Christianity.
Monotheistic Christianity. Okay, need to unpack that a bit. What does the source mean by that specifically? Is it referring to a time before certain theological splits?
Yes, precisely. Before the major schisms and controversies, particularly those erupting around the 4th and 5th centuries CE.
Like the debates about the nature of Christ, Council of Nicaea, that kind of thing?
Exactly. The source points to those debates. So by labeling the Byzantine state as adhering to an earlier, maybe purer monotheistic Christianity, the framework views the shift to Islam not as a replacement, but as a kind of restoration.
A restoration of what?
A return to absolute, unadulterated monotheism, which was facilitated by the Prophet Muhammad's mission.
Ah, I see. So it's framed as an internal reform, an ideological refinement within that continuous political structure of the Rum.
That's the idea. Rather than, say, the abrupt imposition of a completely new faith coming out of nowhere from an outside desert power.
Okay, that explains the ideological continuity argument.
Mm-hmm.
But this leads us straight into what seems like the most geographically radical claim of the whole thesis.
It's definitely a major one.
If this transition was largely internal, happening within this Byzantine Canaanite structure, where was the physical center of this transformation? Where did it happen?
Dr. Waleed is completely unambiguous on this point. The core of Muhammad's message, the center of the mission, the early political hub, it was all centralized in Bika, Jerusalem.
Bika, Jerusalem. Not the traditional location in the Arabian Peninsula.
Not Mecca in the Hejaz, no. According to this research, that's a historical misidentification. The center was Bika, Jerusalem. This completely remaps the cradle of early Islam.
The source uses that name repeatedly. Bika, Jerusalem. Can you elaborate a bit on the significance of that Bika prefix? Why does the research insist on calling Jerusalem that?
Yeah, the use of Beka is absolutely crucial. It's used to link Jerusalem directly to the Quranic reference Baka.
Baka. From Surah Al-Imran, right?
That's the one, Surah Al-Imran 3.96. The source argues that Baka, or Beka, is the true original sacred name for Jerusalem.
And that the traditional location, Mecca in the desert,
has been geographically misidentified throughout history. So, by consistently using Beka Jerusalem, the source is claiming both historical and religious legitimacy for Jerusalem as the singular foundational holy site for Islam's beginning.
Okay. So if Beka Jerusalem was the absolute center of the mission, where does that leave the traditional locations? What about Mecca and Medina? What role do they play in this narrative?
They are definitely recontextualized. The traditional Mecca, for instance, is assigned a very specific but geographically different role.
How so?
The claim is that Muhammad issued a major warning specifically to the children of Israel, the Bani Israel, regarding the people of Tuba.
Tuba, the ancient South Arabian ruler, often linked to Yemen.
That's the one. But the crucial point here is the location. According to the source, this warning didn't happen in the Hejaz. It happened in Mecca, Petra.
Mecca, Petra. So Petra in modern-day Jordan.
Explicitly located in Petra, Jordan. Yes.
That's fascinating. So placing that interaction in Petra physically separates that specific warning event from the central mission location in Becca, Jerusalem.
Exactly. But it still keeps it within that broader Levantine region, not down in the Arabian Peninsula.
Right. It sort of delineates between a secondary, a maybe strategic warning engagement in Petra, which is called Mecca here,
and the primary spiritual and political center, which remains Becca, Jerusalem.
Okay. And what about Medina? The traditional narrative talks about the Hijra to Medina, Medina al-Munawwara.
Well, following the Prophet's journey, the location of his definitive political victory where he establishes his community must also align with this geographical remapping.
Yep.
So in this framework, when Muhammad returned and opened or conquered Medina al-Munawwara, the source asserts that Medina al-Munawwara is synonymous with Becca, Jerusalem.
Medina is Jerusalem.
Yes. It's also referred to, the source says, as Dar al-Salam, the city of peace, which also points to Jerusalem.
Wow.
So that final equation, Medina equals Jerusalem, makes Jerusalem the single, non-negotiable geographical center for the foundation, the consolidation, and the successful establishment of the new religious and political order.
This complete remapping, it totally changes the context for all the major early conflicts then, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shifts them from being, desert skirmishes far away to being battles fought directly over the control of this ancient sacred capital city, Jerusalem.
Right. Which brings us to the next section, the major geopolitical crisis of the early 7th century.
The big one.
The conflict between the Byzantine Romans and the Sassanid Persians. And Dr. Waleed's research argues this wasn't just two empires slugging it out. It was something deeper.
It was framed as a defense of indigenous Canaanite heritage. The narrative centers on a really specific strategic military alliance.
An alliance formed to protect Becca, Jerusalem from foreign occupation.
Exactly. And the partners in this alliance are critical to understand within this framework. It's presented as the Muhammad-Heraclius axis.
Okay. Muhammad, identified here as the leader of the Canaanite Arabs.
Right.
Allied with Heraclius, the Byzantine Roman emperor. Makes sense strategically.
Yes, but the source makes an even stronger, more integrating claim. It argues that Heraclius, the Byzantine Roman emperor, is also identified within this framework as being a Canaanite himself.
Wait, Heraclius was a Canaanite. How?
This identification serves to reinforce that core idea we discussed, that the Byzantine Empire itself was fundamentally an internal political extension of that indigenous Levantine Canaanite identity.
I see. So the alliance wasn't between like an Arab leader and a foreign Christian power.
No. In this view, it was two leaders, both representing different facets of the same continuous Canaanite heritage, uniting against a common external threat.
Okay, so who is that common external threat they were uniting against?
The opposing axis is described as a destructive coalition. It comprised Bani Israel and the Sassanid Persians, led by Khosrow, or Kisra, as he's known in Arabic sources.
And where were they coming from?
They are described as coming from the east, with the specific goal of occupying Becca, Jerusalem.
So this frames that whole early Islamic conflict very differently. It's a battle for indigenous sovereignty over Jerusalem against an Eastern imperial occupation force, which the source says was aided by internal elements, the Bani Israel.
That's the core framing. And this interpretation of the clash is anchored, according to the source material, by powerful evidence from the Quran itself.
Which passage?
Specifically, Surah Ar-Rum, the chapter of the Romans.
Okay.
The source uses the Quranic citation, verses 1 through 6 of chapter 30, Al-Rum 30.1 to 6, to fix the precise historical and geographical context for the initial defeat of the Romans.
Right. The verses talk about the Romans being defeated
in the lowest part of the earth, Adna al-Ard.
Okay. Conventionally, that phrase, Adna al-Ard, is often interpreted more generally, like the nearest land or something similar. How does Dr. Waleed's research interpret that specific geographical phrase to prove the location was near Jerusalem?
His interpretation is very literal and geological. He identifies the lowest part of the earth definitively as the Dead Sea.
The Dead Sea.
Yes, which the source calls Al-Yam al-Qurani, the Quranic Sea. And this is leveraged as sort of unassailable proof because the Dead Sea Basin is, geologically speaking, the lowest point on the surface of the earth.
About 400 meters below sea level, something like that?
Exactly. So that geographical specificity is used to argue that the military engagement, or at least the area where the defeat occurred, was squarely in the Levant region, very close to Jerusalem, confirming the geographical focus of these events.
And the timeline for this Sasanian victory and capture of Jerusalem is usually put around 614 CE.
That's the time frame, yes.
So what were the consequences of that defeat and occupation? The things that then led directly to the formation of this Muhammad-Heraclius alliance?
According to the source, following that Sassanid and Bani Israel victory around 603 CE, because Jerusalem was occupied. And the source emphasizes a specific consequence: the expulsion of the monotheistic Christians.
Those adherents to what the source called the pure pre-schism faith.
Exactly. They were driven out of Beka, Jerusalem by the occupiers. And it's this act, this religious expulsion, that is presented as the catalyst. It necessitated the definitive counterattack.
Okay, so the goal of the Muhammad-Heraclius alliance was fundamentally restorative then. It was about reclaiming the holy city and putting those expelled Christians back.
Exactly. That's how the narrative culminates. Muhammad and his forces identified again as the Canaanites, Phoenicians of Palestine, working together with Heraclius to reverse the occupation.
And they succeed.
They succeed. They regain control, they expel the Bani Israel elements involved in the occupation, and crucially, they reinstate those previously expelled monotheistic Christians.
And this unified victory, what is it called in the source?
It's identified by the source as the historical reality behind the Battle of the Confederates, Al-Azab, which, again, is located as being fought around Beka, Jerusalem.
Not in the traditional location near Medina in the Hijaz.
No, correct. It's placed squarely in Jerusalem. And this victory, the source concludes, is the crucial piece of hidden history.
Hidden history.
Yes, the history that has been unjustly concealed or misinterpreted for centuries. It completely reframes the initial success and establishment of Islam, not as something born in the desert, but as a joint military and political liberation of the ancient indigenous capital, Jerusalem, from foreign occupation and internal treachery.
Okay, that leads us directly into the details of that battle. The Battle of the Confederates, Al-Azab, but fought in Jerusalem.
Exactly. And to really grasp the magnitude of this battle, as the source presents it happening around Beka, Jerusalem, we have to understand the dual nature of the threat faced by Muhammad and Heraclius.
Dual nature.
Yes, as described, the source argues in Surah Al-Azab itself, verse 10, 33.10, the Quranic description mentions enemies coming from above you and from below you, reflecting the extreme stress and the multi-pronged nature of a siege.
Right. And Dr. Waleed's research takes the figures of Gog and Magog, Yajuj and Majuj, which are often seen in like an eschatological context, end times prophecies.
Very much so.
And applies them literally, historically, to the actual forces involved in the 7th century siege of Jerusalem, which the source equates with Medina al-Munawwara.
It's a very direct historical application, yes. Gog, or Yajuj, is identified specifically as the internal threat.
Internal. Within the city walls.
Yes. These are identified as the religious leaders, the men of religion among Bani Israel, who, the source claims, were pretending to believe in Muhammad's mission, but were actually planning to betray him from within Beka, Jerusalem during the siege.
So like a fifth column, using religion as cover.
Exactly, leveraging their position inside the city walls.
How did this internal betrayal actually manifest, like physically, during the siege? How did they help the attackers?
The source provides a specific, almost mechanical explanation for the treachery. It claims these internal figures, the religious leaders identified as Gog Yajuj, opened up the tunnels or crypts underneath Jerusalem. Yes, the source uses the specific term Saradib.
Saradib. That sounds like a very particular architectural feature.
It is. It refers to subterranean passages, crypts, cellars. Ancient Jerusalem's architecture definitely included complex underground systems, cisterns, tunnels, possibly linked to defense or illegal sites.
So they opened these Saradib.
And by doing so, according to the source, they bypassed the main fortifications. They essentially created secret entry points, facilitating the ability of the external invaders to climb the walls or infiltrate the city.
Wow. So they created a strategic breach from within. That transforms it from just a standard siege into a battle against internal sabotage, exploiting the city's own hidden infrastructure.
Precisely. It makes that internal threat just as dangerous, if not more so, than the army outside the gates.
Okay, so if Gog Yajuj were the internal betrayers, the religious figures, who were the external attackers they let in, who is Magog or Majuj?
Magog Majuj are identified as the external counterparts, the military and the financial figures among Bani Israel.
Ah, so the muscle and the money.
Basically, yes. They represent the external aggressors providing the financial backing for the campaign, the organizational structure for the siege, and the actual military force pressing the attack from the outside.
So the Battle of the Confederates, in this Jerusalem-centric view, was a coordinated attack.
Yeah.
You had the financial and military might of Magog on the outside.
Enabled and facilitated by the treacherous religious leadership of Gog operating from inside the city walls.
A pincer movement, essentially, using the city's own structure against itself.
A devastating combination.
And the ultimate result, according to Dr. Waleed's framework, did the betrayal succeed?
No. The result was a decisive victory for the alliance. The source states clearly that God granted victory to Muhammad and Heraclius over this combined internal and external coalition.
And the outcome?
Their ultimate achievement, the culmination of the battle, was the successful seizure and firm control of Beka, Jerusalem, which, again, is explicitly equated with Medina al-Munawwara and Dar al-Salam, the city of peace.
Taken from the defeated invaders.
Taken from the defeated invaders. So the victory wasn't just surviving the siege, it was a definitive political and religious restoration in the ancient capital. It established the new order not through gradual desert expansion, but through the dramatic liberation of the indigenous heartland itself.
Okay, wow. That is a lot to take in. So let's try to synthesize this. What does this massive, really intricate 14,000-year synthesis, based entirely on the research of Dr. Khaled Waleed, what does it ultimately mean for how we might understand the world or history?
Well, fundamentally, it means we have to grapple with the possibility of a radical degree of historical and identity continuity. It's a narrative that starts 12,000 years ago.
Right, 12,000 BCE.
Establishing that Canaanite, Jebusite, Palestinian identity as this single, uninterrupted indigenous Arab root in the Levant.
And that core identity is then presented as the driving force behind the Phoenician maritime expansion.
Exactly. An expansion which, according to the source, not only controlled the Mediterranean, turning it into their commercial lake, but also went on to colonize and even name Europe through that specific linguistic link of Arab and Europa.
Okay. And then this ancient political and commercial infrastructure developed over literally millennia. It doesn't just disappear, it sort of morphs or is inherited.
And eventually manifests as the inherited heritage of the Byzantine state, the Rum, which are also identified as Canaanite in this framework.
Right, which then sees the 7th century shift to Islam, not as this complete break or foreign conquest.
But more as an ideological refinement, a kind of return to pure monotheism happening within that continuous Levantine political and cultural structure.
And absolutely crucially, every single defining event of early Islamic history that we discussed, the mission's core, the specific warnings, the ultimate victories,
is geographically relocated and anchored firmly, singularly, in Beka, Jerusalem.
Which recontextualizes everything. The Roman defeat in 614 CE near the Dead Sea becomes the catalyst.
And the Battle of the Confederates, Al-Azab, becomes the definitive historical liberation of Jerusalem itself from that Sassanid Bani Israel coalition.
A liberation made harder by the internal sabotage of Gog, the religious figures who were helping Magog, the external forces.
Precisely. So the research essentially forces us, or invites us, to confront the possibility that the entire geographical mapping of ancient history and the foundations of early Islam has been maybe obscured or misunderstood.
Keeping this hidden history, as the source calls it, of indigenous Canaanite sovereignty and continuity concealed.
Yeah. It provides this cohesive, though undeniably highly controversial, alternative framework, one where the deep history of the Levant isn't just the backdrop, but the actual driving engine for world civilization and the absolute geopolitical pivot point for that major monotheistic transformation in the 7th century.
So, for you listening, why does engaging with this alternative framework matter?
Well, if we accept this framework, even just to understand it, then the identity of the land's original inhabitants becomes completely inseparable from the very foundation of the religious and geopolitical power structures that dominated the region and beyond for centuries.
It demands we critically engage with how we normally separate historical identities, Canaanite, Phoenician, Byzantine, early Muslim, and also how we map timelines and locations.
Exactly. It asks you to view the Byzantine Empire, the rise of Islam, even the naming of Europe, through this specific Levantine Canaanite lens derived from Dr. Waleed's research.
Okay, now for our final provocative thought, something for you to really mull over, based on everything we've unpacked from the source material today. If the spiritual and political heart of early Islamic history, culminating in that decisive victory, the Battle of the Confederates, if it truly rests in Beka, Jerusalem, the ancient indigenous city of peace. How does that singular, unyielding geographic claim fundamentally rearrange the entire geopolitical map of the 7th century world? And maybe more importantly, how might it reframe the conflicts and the competing claims over historical authenticity and belonging that persist right up to the present day?
That's definitely something to think about. We really encourage you to explore the source material for yourselves, engage with it critically, and consider the powerful, sweeping connections drawn across these vast stretches of time.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the research of Dr. Khaled Waleed.
Until next time.